Welcome, everybody. My name is Stacy Violante-Cote, and I am the Director of Operations at the Center for Children's Advocacy.
In the rain,
we are happy to have you here today to join us for this discussion about domestic violence and the pandemic. And we have some terrific panelists here today to talk with you about this topic. We have quite a few registrants, which tells us that this is a topic of great importance to all of you. And I think our panelists will deliver some great information. So just a bit about the Center for Children's Advocacy and the plan for today. The Center for Children's Advocacy is New England's largest children's civil rights organization. We are a nonprofit law firm providing legal representation and advocacy for children and youth who are most at risk. CCA staff is located in community sites throughout Connecticut, including hospitals and schools, and our work brings us into courts as well as child welfare and juvenile justice facilities. So as to logistics for our time together today, we will ask all participants to mute yourselves, and please do put your questions into the chat. We will monitor the chat, try and take questions if we can during the presentation, and any that we don't get to, we will leave some time at the end for more question and answer. And also, I want to let you know this webinar is being recorded. And so the webinar will be available on the Center for Children's Advocacy's website, cca-ct.org. All right, so as we are getting going today, one thing we wanted to ask you to do to begin thinking about our topic today is, what's one word that comes to mind when you think of domestic violence? You could please put your answers into the chat to really get us all thinking about domestic violence and what comes to mind for you. Our themes and topics for today are to hear about the current status of domestic violence during the pandemic, talk about resources from DCF, providers, and the courts, and specific practice tips about how to engage with clients in domestic violence cases, and also how to gain trust of clients in domestic violence cases. All right. Just give me 1 second. When I'm sharing screen, it's just challenging to be able to see the chat here. All right, so your thoughts about domestic violence are around control, and a few folks are answering fear, verbal abuse, embarrassment, safety. There's an answer here about gaslighting and betrayal. A lot of folks are thinking about the fear associated with domestic violence, control, and some thoughts about the children who are affected by domestic violence. Okay, at this time, I would like to hand it over to Stacy Schleif, who is a senior staff attorney at the Center for Children's Advocacy and is with our Child Abuse and Neglect Project. Stacy, take it away.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. As many of you are aware, for the last 30+ years, October has been designated nationally as Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So we are pleased to have everybody here. As we know, domestic violence is generally spurred by an individual's need to maintain control, one of the words repeatedly mentioned in the chat room. That's by exerting physical, emotional, sexual power over another person. Anything from shoving, choking, punching, to the emotional attacks meant to disparage the victim's abilities or their appearance, to humiliate them, to blame them. Offenders may, for example, want to keep their victims anxious through threats, prevent their victims from leaving by limiting access to money, or limit their ability to visit with family and friends. As early as May of this year, we were seeing articles published across the state about the incidence of domestic violence having risen by more than 20% once people were told to shelter in place. The financial and the food instability during the pandemic compounds the anxiety of catching the virus itself. And that can leave abuse victims even more vulnerable to violence at home. This pandemic has been described as the perfect storm for an abusive personality. That's the combination of isolation, job loss, financial strain, and the stress of distance learning, which all can trigger higher levels of abuse while at the same time closing off a victim's potential means of escape. Shelter staff that we've talked to, they've certainly noticed an increase in domestic violence incidents, both in number and in severity. And then combining that with a reduced opportunity to communicate privately and a lack of space in shelters, we see the serious challenges that are created for our local domestic violence agencies, as well as for our courts. Police departments, as we'll hear more about, have reported anywhere from a 13 to a 25% increase in domestics in Connecticut. And data provided by the Hartford Police Department, for example, indicates an increase of almost 400 calls and 250 domestic incidents from the first quarter this year to the third quarter. So, you know, that's not great. And meanwhile, the number of people that can be accommodated in most shelters has dropped by about 50% or so. We'll hear more about the increase in lethality assessments, which is a tool used by law enforcement to determine whether a victim's in danger of being killed by their abuser. You know, I just wanted to add, it's not all bleak. Data provided by the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, CCADV, shows that calls by advocates, such as yourselves, to victims has increased by 81% during the pandemic, compared with the same period last year. So you all, our service providers, have certainly been doing your part, and that includes attorneys as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's panelists who are far more experienced in this field than I am. Hopefully you can see them on your screen, or at some point you'll be able to. We have Amir Shaikh. He is a contract attorney on our child protection panel. He's been practicing law since 2002, and since 2012, his practice is focused almost exclusively on child protection and criminal defense. We have Alison Karimi, who is an intimate partner violence consultant for DCF. She's worked in varying positions with the department since the year 2000, and she's held this specific position as an IPV consultant for the last 7 years. She's currently in the Hartford Regional Office. She also co-facilitates IPV courses for DCF's Academy of Workforce Development. And then we have Penni Micca. She's the only one I can see on my screen right now, but she's a domestic violence law enforcement advocate at the Interval House, and she's co-located between there and the Manchester Police Department. She provides advocacy, counseling, assistance with safety planning, community education, and training. She's a certified police instructor with Connecticut's Police Officer Standards and Training Council, and she's a founding member and co-chair of the East Central Multidisciplinary Team. So this is obviously a very knowledgeable and experienced panel, with lots of good information to share with you today. I know that they could each probably talk for an hour or more on the topics and the questions, but I'll try my best to keep us on track here. and guide the conversation. So hopefully that works for everybody. And to begin, I just wanted to start with Alison and Penni, start with some definitions. So just at, at a very baseline, Alison, if you're out there still, can you talk about the difference between IPV and domestic violence, when we should use either term?
Sure. So intimate partner violence and domestic violence are used interchangeably right now. As a department, we move towards saying intimate partner violence to follow a lot of the professionals that have been in this field for a long time. What we were learning was that when the police would respond to an incident, if an incident was between an adult son and father, or two adult sisters, or it was between an intimate couple, things were getting classified as all being domestics. And so family violence situations and intimate partner violence situations, everything was kind of getting put into that same topic of domestic violence. When we look at intimate partner violence between a couple, who shares children or not, whether they're a couple now or in the past, there's varying degrees of the abuse, and the abuse can be ongoing. And so there's different approaches to dealing with that as opposed to a family violence situation. So that's how we separated the two, but they are used interchangeably. But from the department's perspective, we did move towards using intimate partner violence to describe past or current abuse between current partners or ex-partners.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Penni, can you describe or explain the restraining order versus a protective order in terms of when and where they're issued, what they cover?
Sure. Restraining orders and protective orders are the two most commonly known orders of protection. There are actually 4 or 5 that are in place that are used. Restraining orders are issued in family court, and protective orders are issued in criminal court. I use mnemonics and think about restraining orders as an order that you request. Remember the difference that one requested in court through family court. And protective orders always include a police officer. To get a restraining order, it needs to be requested by the person who will be the protected party. They need to fill out an affidavit and an application. There's been a number of changes with the pandemic, and now people can apply for those orders online rather than going into the courthouse. That was presenting quite a problem. You can do that on your own. You can do that through Safe Connect, and you can do that through any of the 18 member programs. You can also make arrangements online for marshal service. A restraining order needs to be served. What individuals do is they apply for a temporary restraining order, which if granted is good for up to 14 days. At that point, a hearing is scheduled, and that can, after the hearing, be turned into a restraining order after hearing. If that restraining order is not granted by the court, they are given the opportunity to have a hearing. However, what happens with the hearing is the respondent is served with that paperwork and there are no protections put in place. So safety planning is really important to decide whether or not you want to go forward with that paperwork. A marshal needs to serve the order within 3 days of the hearing date, and that is put into the protective order registry, so law enforcement across the state and the country knows when that order has been served. The moment they're served, they need to abide by the mandates of that order. The other thing that's really important is if someone is served with an order of protection, they need to turn over whatever firearms and ammunition they have within 24 hours. So that certainly addresses safety. Once someone has a hearing, they have the right to tell their story to the judge and to family relations, and that order can be put in place. The difference, one huge difference between a restraining order and a protective order is a restraining order can grant temporary custody to the applicant, and can make stipulations as far as visitation is concerned. People who have children and have a custody order in place can also ask for an order of maintenance that can help with possession of the car, making sure the cell phone hasn't been turned off, paying the rent, keeping the insurance in place. That's good for up to 120 days. You're expected to then go through the family court process to make those things permanent, or at least long-term. One of the biggest issues with restraining orders is it's a too common catch-all for many people. Family, friends, caseworkers will often, across the board, just suggest that somebody get a restraining order. It's really important to do safety planning to figure out whether or not that's the right thing for someone at that particular time. Restraining orders can be applied for by people who are in or have been in intimate partner relationships, dating relationships, have lived together in the past. They used to, and family members, they used to include roommates. They do not include platonic roommates any longer. So it's a great resource for people to have. Protective orders come out of criminal court. Now, usually, in many cases, before a protective order is issued, there's always an arrest that takes place. And before a protective order is issued, many times law enforcement will put a condition of release in place. And I kind of think of conditions of release as temporary protective orders. Once that person is released from custody, the officer puts this condition of release in place that has stipulations like a protective order, but it's only good until they're arraigned in court, which is usually the very next court date. And so it can tell someone that they're not allowed to go back to the residence or have any contact with the victim of any kind. Once they're arraigned in court and the case is initially heard, the judge will usually always put a protective order. Protective orders last for as long as the case is open. They can be a full no contact protective order, they can be a stay away order, or they can be a partial order that does allow contact and or residency. We are seeing more partial orders with the pandemic. You know, judges are a little apprehensive about putting someone out into the street. All of the courthouses, all of the GAs have family violence victim advocates in their courthouses, working with the courthouses, and they can explain the protective order to the person who's listed as the victim and help them work through what they're going to request. Now, they can request anything from a partial to a full, but the judge makes that ultimate decision. Protective orders also, firearms need to be turned in within 24 hours. That's a huge, huge piece. Protective order stays in place for the length of the criminal case, which could be a good amount of time. But there are opportunities to modify that order. Someone might have gotten a partial and because of what's been taking place really feels that they need a full no contact. They may want to change it from a full no contact to a partial, and they can request those things be put into place. Again, the contact with the advocate is really important because once a protective order is vacated, if there's been a conviction, the victim has the right to request a standing criminal protective order. And while a standing criminal protective order it can't be referred to as a lifelong order, I've seen them put in place for 80 years, 90 years, 50 years. What
Can I
has
interrupt for?
Firearms and ammunition need to be turned in to law enforcement or to a licensed gun dealer within 24 hours.
And with a restraining order, do they have to turn in firearms? That was another question we had.
Same thing. They have to turn them in within 24 hours.
Okay.
And failure to turn those in could result in a federal charge.
Wow. Is physical abuse required for a restraining order?
Physical abuse is not required for a restraining order. There could be threatening, and there can be stalking. So both of those can qualify for a restraining order. Restraining orders are not all that easy to get. Certainly, you have the opportunity to write an affidavit and explain the violence and the threats of violence. It needs to be immediate, it needs to be continual, and it needs to show a risk of harm. And then the respondent has the right to address that. So not everybody will get a restraining order.
And from my experience, you can tell me if this is true or not, but the temporary restraining order, which is, it's I think it's ex parte, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And that's significantly easier to get than, once the person is served and they have the right to come back and contest it. The level is, it's a higher standard, or at least there's other evidence submitted at that point.
There doesn't need to be an arrest for a temporary restraining order, but you need to show that these are extreme circumstances and then you and or your children are at risk.
Okay.
I think it's a misnomer to say it's all that easy to get a restraining order. I didn't see that one.
Okay. We do have another question before I guide you guys back on track here, but might as well answer it while it's here. Are there supervised or therapeutic visits ordered for kids whose parent has the restraining order against them?
In some situations, supervised visits are requested. Other times, they are required. I have to admit, they're few and far between as far as something like a supervised visitation center. It can be difficult sometimes to find a third party to supervise that both parties find appropriate, but sometimes that happens.
I would imagine, given the pandemic, it's even harder to find a center that's open that will do something like that.
It's very problematic as far as that's concerned right now.
So, and just to finish up with definitions, I know we hear the word survivor versus victim used, offender versus perpetrator.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, Alison, any of you can speak to that? Is there a preferred terminology?
Well, I think both can be used interchangeably. Certainly when you're talking about criminal justice and, the law enforcement component, oftentimes the language used is victim as far as that's concerned. And it's in context too. If you're speaking to somebody who's just been assaulted, then you talk in terms of you've been a victim of a crime. But survivor is a word of empowerment, and it speaks to progression. Somebody who has gone through or is going through a recovery and feeling stronger. So we certainly like to use the word survivor as often as possible. And sometimes it's just being respectful and finding out what that person, best prefers.
Alison, I was going to ask your perspective from the department, or, and/or as an attorney, Amir, the language we use, how important is that?
Yeah, so from the department's perspective, or, when I'm doing a consultation, writing documentation, I'll use victim or survivor interchangeably. I try to stay away from saying perpetrator. I will document was an offender of IPV, or identifying that person as a person that chose to use violence in that situation. But I do try to stay away from using the word perpetrator. Again, we're coming from a very strength-based perspective, and our whole role is to engage all parties into getting the appropriate services. And so if we're dealing with somebody who's been an offender of IPV, then we want to focus on the strengths that they have, because everybody has strengths, and then focus on, they made this decision to use violence. How can we work together to change that behavior?
In the same way, I guess, that we don't like to label people as addicts, I would say it seems to carry over. You don't want to label a person as that's their one defining characteristic as a perpetrator. So that makes sense.
If we can, we don't work with both parties. We only work with the person who's been victimized. But
Right.
I try to stay away from that language also when interacting with them. You know, this is someone they've been intimate with that is oftentimes, you know, a parent of a child that they have. And I find it most helpful if I don't have a case report with the name to ask what that person's name is, you know, even if it's their first name, and then refer to them by name rather than by perpetrator or abuser.
That makes sense. Before we turn away from restraining orders, and just one other question, if a person is being stalked by someone that they meet online or they don't know, is that a circumstance where they can apply for a restraining order?
That's the circumstance where they can apply for a civil protective order. There's not been an intimate or dating relationship, and that goes through Office of Victim Services. They have advocates that will assist with that.
Okay, thank you. And we're hoping to have some time to turn to the different resources out there, such as the Office of Victim Services, a little later on. I wanted to turn to Amir and ask you, give you a chance to talk about the lens that you're viewing this work through, who your clients are as an attorney, working in a child protection case, and what your obligation, what an attorney's obligation is, on both sides of the coin here.
Right. So panel attorneys, you're going to get appointed to the mom, dad, or the child. I see other panel attorneys on here. I think, whether or not you have the mother and father, I think the first decision you've got to make when you have a case with some significant domestic violence is, are the parents going to decide to go it together and say that they're a united couple, whether they're married or not married, or boyfriend and girlfriend? Are they going to separate, right? And what's the path of least resistance in terms of either keeping the children with one or both of the parents or getting them reunified if there's been an OTC or some kind of removal? So that's decision number one, right? You got to hit the ground running. And I think you got to make that decision very quickly with your client, because if they're going to co-parent, and if there's been a domestic, it's going to be a real uphill battle to prove to everybody that despite them engaging in whatever services they're referred to, that it's been meaningful enough and they've gained enough insight that this kind of incident doesn't happen again. So, that's I think the hardest hill to climb. Even if they do, well in everything from that point forward. So oftentimes the posture is, depending on the severity of the incident, that if the child can be reunified with one of the parents and they are willing to basically end their relationship, in terms of from a parenting and having the kids with them point of view, that's often, I think, an easier route, although it's not easy to get there. But of the two choices, I think it's easier. But these cases are difficult because it's not like if there are substance abuse issues, you can show clean urines, right? Or mental health, you can show a long track record of treatment. With domestic violence, there's a lot of gray areas in terms of demonstrating insight to the department, to a court, so that they know that if the child is placed back with parents, if there's been a removal, that child's not going to be at risk of coming in between a domestic violence event. But I think you've got to make those decisions very quickly and early on to get the case moving forward for your client, whether it's mom or dad.
That can be tough. As an attorney, you want your strategy laid out from the start. As the parents, their relationship is ever evolving. So it's definitely a difficult position to be in, that it does evolve over the course of the case. But I agree with you that it's, having a...
Because you're in this quandary of having to prove a negative, right? Like you have to prove something will not happen. And that's just by its very nature is a hard thing to prove.
Right. And so depending on whether you're representing, for lack of a better word, the perpetrator or the victim in a case, how are your obligations? How do they differ? How do you approach that differently?
In terms of, obviously, if you have a victim, I'll use the word victim. I'm just, if in that instance, just to be simple, right? I think, removal from the situation, right? There's like a clearer path forward. Whereas if you have, actually, I'm going to withdraw that. Meaning, if you have someone who is the victim and they separate themselves, that's a clear path forward, and there's no further contact with whoever the aggressor was. If there's a situation where they're united, it's murky. But I mean, it's harder there. Whereas if you had someone who is clearly like an aggressor in a situation and has demonstrated insight through his services and programs, and they were just an aggressor in the situation, I mean, I even think that's a little of an easier task to prove than the couple that stays together where there was a victim and an aggressor. You've got to show that that's not going to happen again. So I mean, it's very, very difficult to get there, and you're going to meet with a lot of resistance in terms of, I think, that the people, the social workers and the supervisors who are involved in showing that it's meaningful insight. I mean, often a psychological evaluation is helpful. You're going to have to really have good service providers who will be able to give good testimony at a trial about how long they've been in services, what the level of services were, and that the parents have really been able to demonstrate a level of insight sufficient to convince a judge that a child won't be at risk if placed back in that home.
Thank you. I see a question. How do you help someone who reports being in an abusive relationship but is hiding it? And I think that can help us shift gear. You know, as an attorney, you know, that's your job to keep that information confidential, which is different, you know, than working with your DCF social worker or you know, if the client is working with a domestic violence counselor, you know, and the best you can do with them is counsel them. And I think that kind of shifts gears to Alison in terms of, you know, the safety planning that the department does with victims. Can you talk about that, and, you know, in general, how DCF approaches cases with IPV
Sure.
and working with both perpetrators
Sure.
and survivors?
Oh, I think can you still hear me? I think my
Yes.
camera, hang on, my camera was freezing, so I'll work on that while talking. You guys can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So the department, the way that we approach, you know, working IPV cases, is first and foremost, it's super important to foster a supportive and collaborative working relationship. And that's with all family members. Can you guys see me yet or no?
No.
Okay. So we take the approach, the department, we work with all family members, meaning we work with the survivor, we work with the offender, and we work with the children. And so when we're doing that, we're simultaneously looking to address the IPV concerns, but any other concerns that are going on within that family as well. And so it became paramount when we came on in 2013, how much we needed to engage and work with the offender, the identified offender. Now, we've always worked with the identified victims, but the need became very apparent because if we can get that person to change behavior and to get to some point of acknowledging, you know what, okay, the way I'm handling the situation is not working for me. It's not working for my children, and they can commit to wanting to make changes, then that's a win. It's a win for the entire family, whether that couple stays together or not. So what we do is, you know, we start with trying to meet the offender where they're at. I don't expect them to come out and tell me every little detail of what happened, especially if there's a criminal case involved. They're not going to give me the details of the entire incident. Some may. So I usually start by I'm not there to pass judgment and judge this person. I'm involved because a report came to the department's attention and there's a concern of intimate partner violence, and I want to hear from you. And I kind of start with identifying the strengths that I know about that person, whether they're working, you know, they support their home, they've had some really good parenting. And then I go back and I actually start talking about the offender's childhood. Tell me about your childhood. Tell me about the people that were important in your life. Who are your role models? Assessing to see, did they experience childhood abuse themselves or exposure to IPV as a kid. And that kind of builds a bridge there. Instead of just coming at an offender with, look, this is what I got. This is the report. It says you did A, B, and C, and I need you to do this service. It's having a conversation, engaging with that person and getting them to then talk about the parent that they want to be, how they feel their children see them as a person, how they want to be viewed by their children. And so that's how we engage in working with the offender. When we're working with victims, we're meeting the victim where they're at. Most victims have been safety planning all along, safety planning in the IPV perspective, long before the department became involved. So we validate their strengths and everything that they've been doing thus far. We acknowledge that, their partner made a choice to be abusive. And that's not something that's their fault. We acknowledge that many victims have great parenting. They're working, they're supporting a home. So we partner and we validate all of those things. And then we look to enhance their safety planning by working together and collaborating with them, other providers in the community, whether that's through one of the 18 centers through the Connecticut Coalition, or other service providers that we have. I mean, we offer a multitude of supportive services to the family. And again, it's about meeting the victim where they're at. We explore family, we explore friends they have. If they're involved with, there could be a priest, a minister, an imam. There could be, anyone that's a support or resource we will explore. And we do the same thing, with the offender that we're working with. And we actually, one of the biggest pieces that we do as a department is exploring the offender's willingness to protect their child, right? And exploring and identifying that it was a decision to use violence. And there's probably 3 other choices that could have been made in that situation. And getting to an understanding of that, and then moving forward to that commitment, for change behaviors. So I don't know if that helps a little bit about what we do, and then I can move into the role of the IPV consultant.
Sure, that would be helpful, as well as, going into a little bit about what resources, especially during the pandemic, and I'm sure Penni can touch on this too, but what resources are available and being used more now that we're in this different state of life.
Mm-hmm.
Could I just add 2 things on the comments that I see, Stacy?
Oh yeah, I wasn't looking at them.
So just in terms of DCF's willingness to return children when there's been a case of domestic violence, I think you're gonna have to get comfortable with a child protection attorney. I'm sure you guys all know this in trying cases, right? You're gonna have to litigate these issues and get them before a judge. I think, relying on the department to come around client's position on things and waiting for too long, I mean, you're going to be at a TPR before you know it. And I think you really got to get out in front of these issues quickly, early, and file motions to revoke commitment, object to permanency plans, and litigate them early and often, right? Like Chicago voters. Because ultimately you want a judge deciding where children should reside, right? You don't want to let things happen to your case. I think if your clients are in a position where they've done services, where they have witnesses that you can call, you're going to have to put that evidence on and let a court decide whether or not it's an appropriate situation or not. Because the backdrop to a removal is children are sitting in a foster placement where presumptively there are no issues of intimate partner violence, right? So you're asking Department of Children and Families to say, oh, well, take a child out of that context and give them back to parents. I mean, regardless of what the parents have done, it's always going to be a question, right? In I think the chain of command's mind of whether or not that's safe for the child, right? And I think there's no blame in that analysis, right? I think that's the department's perspective, and I think they're doing their obligation, right, by keeping a child safe. Right? If you have a parent, your obligation to your client is to get them reunified with their child. So I think you really got to call out, if you have evidence to present, you've got to get it in front of a judge and present the evidence. And with the restraining orders, the only thing I wanted to add to that comment, the commentary there is, the restraining orders can be a real slippery slope for parental alienation, because if a restraining order doesn't allow contact, and you can't have third-party contact, and if you have a father or a mother who's, you know, the subject of the restraining or protective order, either one, you really have to try to get that modified to allow the child to have contact with the parent, because otherwise, if it just stays in place and nothing happens, you're going to alienate that parent from that child.
I did see something in the chat about, you know, children having visits in these cases, and, you know, if they don't want them, a lot of that depends on the age of the child and the strength of their advocate, you know, and what conditions I think can be proposed in order to allow the child to feel safe. Whether it's at a supervised visitation center, whether it's a therapeutic visits, what conditions can be integrated into the visits to allow for that to happen. There definitely needs to be some communication and thinking outside the box and negotiation when it comes to that. It's not necessarily an all or nothing. That would be my answer to that, even though I'm not on the panel here. Alison and Penni, can you talk about what you're seeing, you know, at the police department or at Interval House, how the pandemic has kind of influenced what you're seeing in terms of domestic violence? Maybe touch upon these lethality assessments.
Well, certainly calls for service are up both in law enforcement and with our domestic violence program. And what we're seeing through CCADV statewide is that the pandemic has really exacerbated things. Statewide calls are up 30% for Safe Connect. Interval House has seen a 56% increase in contact with victims of domestic violence. Our shelters are over capacity, plus we have to safety distance, so the numbers are lower, and we are putting families in motels at an astronomical rate to make sure we keep them safe. Calls for service for the police departments are up incredibly. One of the things that we are seeing is a huge increase in the number of violations of protective orders. Judges don't want to put offenders into Department of Corrections, so bonds are kept low because of the pandemic, and they're also hesitant at times to take people out of their homes. And so partial protective orders are put in place, particularly with the low bond. We see people oftentimes reoffending 2 or 3 or 4 times. They're starting to address that more. Some of those bonds are increasing, and we are seeing some people need to be sent to the prisons because of that. But I have had months where 50% of the cases that have come into the department have involved a violation of the protective order, which is huge. One of the things that police departments use across the state is something called the Lethality Assessment Program. This is a voluntary program that's put in place in partnership between all of the police departments in the state, CCADV, and the 18-member programs. The fact that it's voluntary and everybody participates says a lot in and of itself. And so the police officers will administer a screening. It's an 11-question screening. And based on the answers that they answer yes to and the numbers that they answer, they may determine that that person is at increased risk of being a victim of homicide. And so once they've screened in, they immediately call the hotline at the 18-member programs. And so that puts them in contact with an advocate immediately. And did you want to ask something?
I was sorry, yeah. Just so we're all on the same page, can you just mention what Safe Connect is and the 18-member I think that's
Sure.
fairly new.
Sure. Safe Connect is a hotline that goes through CCADV. It is fairly new. It started at the beginning of the year, and it is Connecticut's domestic violence resource hub. So they have a 24-hour hotline. They offer information and safety planning and short-term counseling. Then they make referral to the 18 member programs for ongoing services. They
So
have,
as it had been previously, from my understanding, the victims would individually call different shelters when they were looking to reach out, and now it's this one number they call, and from there they, we figure out where the open beds are and where the relevant services are. Is that accurate?
usually what they do is they call the Safe Connect number. So that's your initial contact with the DV organizations, and they will refer to the organization that person resides in. So if somebody lives in Hartford, they'll take the immediate call, they'll do the safety planning, and then contact Interval House to look for shelter, to provide shelter. You have to keep in mind that shelter is only one of the services that we offer, and the majority of people don't go into a safe house, but that need is immediate when they do have it. And so they refer over. At that point, most of the contact is then with the member program for that individual.
Alison, can you talk a little bit? I found it really interesting when we were talking earlier about some of the new issues that have arisen during the pandemic and things that you, different ways of safety planning that you have to do now compared to previously.
Sure. Real quick before I get into that, just as the intimate partner violence consultant, and there's consultants out of every DCF office, we provide ongoing consultation through the life of a case when it comes to anything to do with IPV. And that consultation entails going through the history of IPV that's occurred in that current relationship, history in past relationships, just to give us an indicator of what the person's violence has been. We go out, we interview all parties, the victim, the offender, we talk to the kids. A lot of times we're giving, information. A lot of times survivors and victims, they don't even think that what they're going through is as serious as physical violence. So like isolation, for example, financial control, emotional abuse, verbal abuse. A lot of times when you're meeting with a victim or a survivor, they're like, well, I'm not getting beat. And those are words you'll hear sometimes. And then when you start going through the different types of violence, you'll see like people's faces are changing. They're like, wow, I go through that. Yes, I go through that. And so there's a lot of education and a lot of support that we offer. And the same thing with offenders. And I don't just meet with these individuals once or twice. Sometimes we meet with them ongoing. And I attend like ACRs, which are our case plan reviews. I attend the consider removal meetings. I help with, how we write language. So there's no blaming and shaming language when we're identifying there's been IPV. So, and then collaboration with all our community providers and getting individuals to the appropriate services. And we do, a lot of many other things. But getting to some of the safety planning that we've been doing since the pandemic, one of the things early on that I identified for staff, and even in talking to some of the providers that I work with, was with isolation right now, was to identify a code word. That code word could be anything. Let's say the code word was identified as pineapple, but if that's an established code word, if the client was to say that word, that A, they're not in a safe situation, or it could be you've established if you hear that word, please call for help. Or you could establish that if you hear that code word, it's because the other person is there and I can't talk to you about what's going on. And so with us moving to FaceTime and Zoom and team meetings, and again, that isolation, it was really important to develop a code word like that. Even before the pandemic hit, when I would go out on home visits, sometimes you would just get a feeling, even though I would say, are we the only ones in the home? Is it you, the child? And they're like, yep, it's just me. Sometimes you would get a feeling like that may not be the case. And I would always write on my notepad, are we the only ones here? And I have to tell you, a few times after writing that, the person they shook their head that somebody else was in the house. And I say that because as much as technology is helpful to us today, it's also very dangerous when we're dealing with IPV. And it's dangerous in the sense of listening devices, video cameras being installed to see what's going on. There are apps that can be downloaded to individuals' phones that are sending their text messages, their emails, everything they're doing on that phone in live time to the other person. There are spoofing apps where somebody can call and the phone number coming up on a victim or survivor's phone could be the school number, a family member's number, a pediatrician's number, because they're trying to get in touch with that person to get their new address if they relocated. So we really take a lot of time when we're talking about safety planning. When I go out on situations, I did not talk about safety planning in the home. I would step outside and we would talk about a safety plan, or we would do that in the office. We would not do it in the house because I didn't know if any of those technologies were set up, and I didn't want anybody to get information as to if that person was in serious trouble, where would they go, and getting that identifying information. So we do a lot around that. We do a lot with utilizing Safe Connect 24/7. Like Penny said, someone can call Safe Connect to safety plan, to enter confidential shelter, to set up to talk to a victim advocate. And there's tons of other resources out there. Do you want me to go into like a lot of the other the resources and what we give?
I maybe if we have time in a minute, one question I did want to ask for Amir is, in terms of safety planning as an attorney, is there anything you can think of, any tips or how, anything specific when you see that there's IPV in your cases or DV, how you approach them differently in terms of safety planning at all, either from your perspective or in advising your client?
I mean, I think that either if you have the alleged victim or the alleged perpetrator, making it clear to everybody, kind of what's at stake, right? And how closely they're being monitored and watched, right? And I think a lot of the times, sometimes clients will take the position that, oh, well, if we act a certain way for a certain period of time, DCF's going to go away and we're going to get our kids back. And I think the quicker you get rid of that notion that this is something that you can sweep under the rug, right? That it's, if you jump through the right steps in the right way, the quicker you can make it clear that that's really not going to work, because it never does, right? Like there has to be meaningful insight and change in both the victim and the perpetrator, whether they're going to be separate or together, right? And I think the more that you can emphasize that, and the more it can resonate with your clients, I think the quicker you can try to at least get them reunified with their children, right? If they play these games where they circle around and around, oh, we're not together, we're together. I'm not a victim, I'm a victim. I was abused, I wasn't abused, right? That's not helping anybody. And you're dealing with sophisticated agency on the other side that I don't think you're going to be able to fool. I don't think, so I think as an advocate, the reality has to set in very quickly with your clients, and you've got to have that conversation, and you've got to be like brutally honest with them and what the stakes are and how quickly these cases do move through juvenile courts. It's not like a criminal court. Juvenile court moves very quick. Before you know it, you're at a permanency plan hearing. Before you know it, you're at a termination. In the scheme of things, like it seems like a long period of time. It isn't. And so the faster they act and the more real it becomes, I think that's how you're going to get good outcomes. if you kind of just wait and let the clients dictate the direction, you know, you're setting them up, I think, for disaster down the line.
Good advice. I see a question. Does CCADV file reports with DCF if children are involved? I guess, does that mean, are they mandated reporters?
Yes, CCADV, Safe Connect, and all of the member programs are mandated reporters. So if we believe that a child was put at risk and is an immediate risk of harm or danger, then we make that call.
Okay.
We do, however, offer, except for the mandated reporting, we do, however, offer confidentiality, and that's based on state statute. And that allows them to talk openly and honestly.
And do they assist victims with legal filings?
We assist CCADV and all of the member programs. We assist with filing restraining orders. We can do that digitally and cover everything from filing for the restraining order to having the marshals serve the order. The member programs also assist in court with family relations and are allowed in many situations to stand by the victim in the courtroom. None of us are attorneys, but we have assisted with pro se paperwork as far as divorces are concerned or custody paperwork, and we provide support throughout those processes.
So as I guess, you know, as we get ready to close out, Alison, if there is, you know, one real takeaway, or I know there's not real one that you can pinpoint, but in terms of resources, I mean, it sounds like Safe Connect, CCADV, those are, that's what we should be aware of. I know there's many others.
Yeah. I mean, there's many. So like the Office of Victim Services, if there's been an arrest, right, and you have identified victims and the children were present, the Office of Victim Services is fantastic. I always encourage individuals to call to get their victim applications completed to see if they will qualify for any victim benefits. And again, that's up to that office to decide. But they also now have VOCA case management, and it's www.ctfsa.org. And they provide any victim of crime ongoing support services, assessments, case management, safety planning. There's a list of things that they will support individuals with, as well as children. SNEHA is, I always think about, you know, we have to come from a cultural perspective too. SNEHA is for Southeast Asian women, and it's a local resource in the Hartford area where they'll provide support services to anyone that identifies as Southeast Asian. We also have Micca, which is down in the Wallingford area, that also supports Southeast Asian women, but also Middle Eastern women. And so sometimes the cultural piece, not sometimes, all the time, it's huge. And when you have someone that's fearful because you have all these systems and departments that are involved, to just be able to have that to relate in the same language, it goes so far. And so we're constantly looking for, you know, different resources and supports. Those are huge ones. The Hartford Behavioral Health offers Project Save for victims of IPV or sexual assault. It's grant funded. So someone doesn't have insurance, then it's not an issue. So that's another huge program. The Village offers rapid response for children from birth to 17 who've been exposed to IPV, abuse, community violence, and they will offer about 5 to 6 sessions over like a 6-week period. They do trauma assessments, and then they can help refer for additional support. So that's a key service, that if there's a situation where a child witnessed an IPV incident, and, you know, where they were fearful, they were having a hard time, the fact that their parents, you know, have now been separated, or they saw one family member has been injured, getting that service into play right away is really huge to help reduce long-term trauma effects, you know, within that child. The department offers IPV Fair, And that's a family assessment intervention response. And it's a clinical service that will do individual counseling with the victim, individual counseling with the offender. If it's deemed safe and the victim wants to, there is a component for co-parenting. And they also do child assessments, and that program is overseen. I'm the gatekeeper for that. Every office has it available, but the department has to have an open case. The family has to have an open case for it to be generated. And that's a very good program. Carla Stover out of Yale helped develop that. So there's the Connecticut Institute for Refugees and Immigrants. They offer a lot of services, any legal assistance for if someone may be undocumented and fearful. They're a great resource. They also offer like ESL. And again, SafeConnect. I mean, I'm trying to go real fast here to try to get as much info out to you guys. And then of course, I mean, as far as my role, it's ongoing, and I'm constantly, meeting with individuals to go over things and to offer resources. One good tip I can give you guys. Go ahead. I wanted to give one good tip.
Go ahead.
So a lot of times a victim, they're not ready, to talk about what's going on. They're not ready, or they're scared because of the system's fear of the thought of losing their children. And so I always talk to individuals about doing a hypothetical safety plan. And a hypothetical safety plan, I tell people every time you have contact with your individual, just acknowledge, I know you're saying nothing's going on and you're good. I just want to kind of talk about, in the event you ever found yourself in a situation where you were feeling scared, harassed, unsafe, what would you do? Would you call the police? Do you have somewhere you can go that's safe? And if you don't, remember SafeConnect. Remember I talked to you about that? You can call and they can get you to confidential shelter. And what you're doing is you're planting a seed, because they're going to remember that conversation if you keep having it. And you're not coming at them in a judgmental way. You're just coming at them like, listen, if you're ever in a situation.
That's super helpful. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to end it. That's a really good approach to take, especially where, a lot of people aren't really ready to talk openly about what they've been experiencing. So that's great advice, addressing it in the hypothetical. And
the cultural competency, Stacy, is really important, because I think you'd be silly to discount implicit bias when you come to domestic violence cases in Black and brown males, right? Especially ethnic minorities. And I think, you can't ignore it, right? It's you have to come to the understanding that there are going to be biases in assumptions made based on the race and ethnicity and gender of perpetrator and victim. So you just got to acknowledge it's there. You got to deal with it in the best way you can, and when appropriate, you got to point it out. And whether it's at a case status conference, whether it's a trial, you got to bring it to everybody's attention. And I think it'd be silly not.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. That's an excellent point that we all need to be aware of.
As far as the question for the list of providers, I would be happy to formulate a list, and then Stacy, I can send it to you.
That would be great. I cut and pasted all of the chat into a Word document, so I'll go back through it and see if there's questions we didn't get to. Try my best to get out to you all with answers, figure out the answers and get out to you all. Thank you so much to our panelists, to Penni, Alison, and Amir, as well as to the Office of the Chief Public Defender for sponsoring this for us. You guys are really interesting to listen to, so I appreciate your time, and thank you everybody for joining us today. As you can see, we've been recorded here, and it will be available on our website, as well as other COVID-specific resources that you may be interested in and be looking for. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And like I said, we'll be in touch with any other answers we can provide and any other resources. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
the opportunity to talk to everyone, and thank you for the work you do.
Likewise. All right, take care.